Thanks, Doctor. Thanks, everyone, for being here. This is the first in-person event that Conflict has launched. It has been a long time since we've been able to get together, and even though we're masked up and it's not the most comfortable way to communicate, I just want to say it gives me enormous pleasure to see everyone just back here. I know that this is a limited group because we had to limit the audience with the usual strictures, but it will be recorded. Paul has kindly agreed, and so have the speakers, to put it on a recording. So if you have friends who couldn't make it or who are teaching conflicts, whatever it is, let them know that this will become an event they can check into and maybe follow up in some future way with Paul on or any of the speakers. I also want to say that it is a particular pleasure for me personally to have Rebecca joining us from Toronto. She was really almost on the brink of coming, but there are border nightmares to be faced. It's not unproblematic yet, but we hope that we can issue a rain check and get her to return and do something again with us. Well, we know that will happen. And also a thanks to Paul for going through the various hoops to be allowed in from the outside. This is quite a ritual, and he persevered, but it's also a homecoming for him. He was, as Dr. mentioned, a fellow, or I don't know if you did mention, he was a fellow, I think, in 2008 or 9 with the German department, and he spoke, I remember, gave a very, very daunting, impenetrable talk on shine, appearance, and Benjamin. And my theory is that there's a little kernel of that going on here. Shine and likeness, maybe Hent will get there, or maybe you will. So I'm not going to take more time. I'm going to turn it over first to Paul to say a few words about the book. Then we will have Rebecca speaking to us in the room, even if she's far away, and I actually have a few thoughts of questions to kick off discussion. Thanks.
Hi, y'all. Thank you for coming. And it is truly great to be in the presence of people with bodies, breathing, thinking. Thank you to Emily and to Zakir and to Santiago for bringing me, and to Hent also, and Rebecca for responding to the book. I'm going to just say a couple of things so you have a little idea what's going on in there, because it is bizarre. And I'm going to address just for 5 to 10 minutes at the most your inner dialectician who says likeness. That's not critical. Do you have one of those? Because everything's like everything else. You don't have that. Okay, that's good. So you're already there. Likeness, it has to be different. If it's not different, we can't support it. Well, so to do that, I'm going to go quickly back to Hegel's logic. A really brief dip in. Hegel says in the section, book 2, the doctrine of essence, essence as reflection within, and then the determinations of reflection. You don't need to know any of that. You can look it up there. Quote, the proposition that there are no two things which are like each other strikes the imagination as strange. That's Hegel. He wasn't really tender towards likeness, Hegel, because it was problematic for the idea of difference. He wanted the determination to come out of not the degree of difference. You couldn't have a degree of difference between mental or real or spiritual entities. They had to be absolutely different. They had to be different enough that they couldn't be confused. That would be one criteria. Here he's thinking of the other side of that, which is Leibniz's idea that every single individual thing has to be a grade of different from every other individual thing. And this kind of thinking is what the book meddles in. It raises the question, are there things? Hegel was not tender towards likeness, but he was tender towards things, whether they were conceptual or ontological, and of course for him they were both. At this part of the logic, he tells this anecdote about Leibniz. He doesn't talk about Leibniz that often, but he tells this anecdote about Leibniz, who was at court talking to the Princess Sophie of Herrenhausen and one other person. And the Princess Sophie and he had a correspondence for many years where she brought a lot of her experiences and philosophical thinking to some of his tenets, and he changed a lot of them because of this interaction. She said, there can't possibly be two identical leaves. The principle that Leibniz is developing here and exemplifying through this anecdote is the identity of indiscernibles. That is to say, if something is indiscernible from another thing, it is that thing. So everything is slightly different. That's the principle. So at this party, this other stranger says, well, of course we can find two different leaves. I mean, two same leaves. We can find two same leaves. So he goes out to look for them. He spends almost an hour rummaging through the leaves at court while Leibniz and Princess Sophie talk. And he comes back to agree with them that there are no two that he can find that are the same. For Hegel, this is important because he wants to do away with the entire question of likeness and unlikeness. It's not merely determinative enough. It's not reflective enough in his vocabulary. It's too indeterminate, you could say, or they're too close to one another, likeness and unlikeness. What's not really spoken about in the anecdote or in Leibniz's principle of indiscernibles is that in order to claim that two things are different, they have to be like enough for that to make sense. Does that make sense? They didn't go out and look for leaves and donkeys to see if they were unlike enough to call them unlike. Makes no sense. So unlikeness only makes sense in a zone of likeness. Likewise, likeness only makes sense in a zone of unlikeness. They're so close as to be indeterminate from one another. And that's the principle from which the book starts. They're indeterminate. Anything that's like is also as unlike in potentially infinite number of ways. Why Hegel didn't like this and why I like it is that it opens up the field of things to something other than things. Hegel talks in this section about the threat that likeness poses to what he calls the ordinary tenderness for things. You might recognize Hegel as not a very tender person. Well, I think in some respects he was. He brought his illegitimate child into his house and raised him as his own child. Maybe the acts of producing that child were not so tender, or maybe they were. Likeness threatens what he calls the ordinary tenderness for things, that we have an attraction to things, things being bounded, things being separable from one another, things containing their qualities within themselves. And the proposal of this book is that things don't contain their qualities within themselves, and our most common experience shows this to be true, that everything that you recognize as a thing is already a memory of another thing that was like it. So experience comes out of an encounter between the perceptual and the memory field. That would be human experience. But it turns out that this is true across a whole bunch of fields. The good explanation of the perceptual field and its relation to memory comes in Bergson, but the experience of the likenesses among the field of organisms comes up very clearly in Darwin. So the book tracks this in what Caillois calls a diagonal science, which cuts across all the established sciences and brings out their dependence on likeness in all of them. It turns out that the world is not organized into things, but into a certain kind of object, which Caillois called the bizarre privileged item in the universe, which is actually an overlap of multiple determinations. And his example for it is the Brain Mantis. Brain Mantis is like a religious figure. It's like other praying mantises. It's like in its sexual appetite a certain human fantasy. It overlaps a psychological, mythical, scientific, even a cosmic and a theological realm. So he wanted to organize the science around these objects that bring all the sciences together and are the kind of crossing points of diagonals. So I'll leave my pocket introduction to the book right there. And thank you for coming and pass it on to
Rebecca.
Rebecca, sorry. It's all yours.
Thanks. Can you hear me, everybody?
Yes. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Thanks so much for having this event, and thanks so much for this amazing book, Paul. I'm really sorry I can't be there. So I don't really have a formal talk here. I've really got a couple of observations and a few questions. So which I just like to put on the table, and hopefully we can talk about them. I'd really like to hear what you think, Paul, and other people. So yeah, I'm glad you began by giving us some kind of entree into your book, which I just find so difficult to kind of summarize or paraphrase, starting with the genre of the book itself, which I was really not sure what it was I was reading as I was reading it, starting with the fact that I've never ever read a book written almost entirely in the second person to the second person, with such a vocal address and instructions while speaking. I write a lot in the second person, but usually that's the way of masking, not using the first person, masking confession as as a description of someone else. But this was actually this book, which on the one hand has the trappings, but also the rigor of an inferential, logical argument and deduction, in spell it in great rigor and clarity. At the same time, is just soaring with these lyrical and poetic formulations that I could only just startle at every time they would strike, they would kind of appear from the page, combined with this combination of huge, almost grandiose, this huge project of which unapologetically calls itself a cosmology and a theory of everything, and at the same time has this deadpan tone and funny lexicon, to be honest, bristling with these neologisms and kind of technical terms like homeotician and homeosis and homeosphere and BPIU, the acronym for the title itself, which appears several times, which I thought this combination itself struck me as incarnating some of the ideas that Paul is following through. I guess I have one or two observations and then some questions, and my observation, which is really more of a musing. I was really struck by, and this is another the kind of strangenesses of this book, this combination of huge cosmological import with this, on the one hand, this deadpan delivery, but also the language of approximation, almost, usually a slight preference for, this kind of tentativeness and tenuousness of the topic itself, of the object itself, if it is an object, that is to say, likeness, with its synonyms, which are not quite synonyms, which Paul distinguishes very rigorously, and then notably blurs them by using them at times interchangeably, which I found super interesting as well. But this language of almost, nearly, quasi, approximately, not quite, and the best of all, almost, which Paul parses into the all, the mostly all, and all mostly, the all, the kind of concatenation of the all and the most that is crystallized in that word itself. What I particularly liked, or what would grab me, because it seemed to introduce homeosis into the far reaches of grammar itself, and suggested that this is not just about nouns and adjectives or even verbs, likeness, likening, enlikening, and so on, but also about the way in which likeness and liking has an adverbial force, and introduce a kind of shift in modality. So since Paul is thinking about, something which is para-ontological and not quite, or not always about beings. At times it's a war between ontology and homeosis. It's interesting, to think about how the language of predication itself would be informed by that. So I was really struck by the language of probability, actually, that courses through this work, which is not used in the sense of statistics, but in the sense, I think, of likelihood. What is likely? What is not simply possible, but even probable? And so I was thinking about what likely means, and what likelihood means in the context of a logic of likeness, and what the logic of likelihood is, shorn away from its statistical use. And the strangeness of this little word. I mean, one of the things that Paul's book does is it sort of keeps dragging you into this abyss, where I found myself just going down these rabbit holes of words, and thinking about how the post-positive suffix li, or lich in German, the li of likely, which really derives from like itself. So likeliness, and to be likely, is in a sense to already have likeness reduplicated and recursively redoubled in an adverbial sense. So it's something that's likely, it's it's approximating in the verbal domain, likeliness itself. So this kind of penumbra, adverbial penumbra, attaching to the adjective itself. And of course, likely itself is indistinguishably an adjective and an adverb. So that was my first little thought. The second portion of that little thought was something which I was curious about, which is that the lich, that we hear, is in fact derivative of the word for corpse. It's the Leiche in German. And it's something I'll come back to later, but I was intrigued by this kind of deadly quality that seems to be connected, perhaps, to likeness itself, which actually, to be honest, made me think a lot about Blanchot when I was reading. So my questions, I have basically I have two or possibly three questions, depending on how much time we have. The first question is about history, and I want to ask this with particular reference to Benjamin in this work. My second question has to do, it's not unconnected to this, but it has to do more specifically with Marx. And my third question, although maybe we can return to this later, because I'm not sure that this time this now actually has to do with psychoanalysis, which is kind of always at the edges, but I'd love to hear more about it. So yeah, my first question vis-a-vis history, I wanted to, Paul begins by making this really emphatic anti-Foucauldian gesture, which seems to me is really about much more than Foucault himself. That is, say, the rejection of Foucault's relevant in this context, because the context is the order of things in which Foucault famously introduces this break, this epistemic break between the classical age of resemblances, or one might say likeness, and the modern age of representation, which Paul emphatically rejects. I mean, both that particular idea of a break, but I think more generally the idea of historical breaks themselves. So not only have we never become modern, so to speak, and we have never left the age of resemblance, which Paul, you associate explicitly many times with the archaic. Not only have we never left that, but resemblance or likeness is itself the kind of glue or the viscosity that connects epochs and introduces a kind of historical similarity, which seems to speak against the idea of historical rupture or break. So the affinity between epochs, which is itself a likeness, seems to erode the possibility of any definitive break between an epoch of likeness and an epoch of something else. That's something else which has informed the modern sciences and philosophy and just about everything else. So what I wanted to ask here, I take your point, and I do appreciate your point, but what I wanted to ask was, is there not a specific historicity to the contemporary mutation of likeness in the what I'm going to call for now the modern age? I want to talk about my mimesis and where I, and the mimetic faculty of Benjamin, which one finally gets to, and the faculty that is not a faculty, that is not a potency or power. And I was really struck, Paul, by the way in which you shifted attention away from the early language essays to the 1933 essays on similarity and mimesis, roughly the essays that are roughly, of course, contemporary with Caillois' writing on the topic. And in doing so, you seem to be shifting attention from the early emphasis on the fallenness of language, where mimesis or something that could be likened to that, the possibility of Adamic naming, and so on, that the mimesis is a lost contact, a loss in language, a rupture of language, a fall, corresponding to the arbitrariness of the sign, and so on, which gets grafted onto historical narratives of allegory, of sexualization, of modernization, and so on and so forth. So I found it intriguing that you're not interested in that narrative, and I do get that. But what I'm curious about is if you give up the idea of some kind of break, do you hive away the specific historical index of an effacement of likeness, an effacement of the capacity for mimesis, that 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 Benjamin himself, that doesn't need to be thought of in terms of fallenness or, the theological and any such theological trope, although that trope itself may be, securing maybe functioning as a kind of placeholder for that. So when Benjamin talks about language as the place where the mimetic, where the mimetic faculty has migrated, and describes this in terms of non-sensuous correspondences. This is not just about the losing or the effacement of the mimetic faculty, the fall into the arbitrariness of the sign and so on, but it does seem to point to something compensatory or some loss of sensuousness, that itself is being registered and seems to have a modern index. So I just wanted to think about that a little bit, and I've been particularly, perhaps this is just the Adorno in me speaking, or reacting here, but when Adorno, cleaving to what he thought was Benjamin, spoke of the kind of the introduction of modern instrumental reason, which begins almost immediately as the compulsion to identify, to classify, to make sensuous particularity, not the best word, but let's use it for the time being, as the token of a type or subsumed under exchange value, scientific law, a priori concept, scientific procedure, and so on. One symptom of this process was as he saw the dichotomy between art and science, where art is, and therefore as a degraded form, is a kind of repository or residue of a discarded mimetic apprehension of sensuous particularity, and the separation, between art and science, say, which is one of the dichotomies, which I see your trans science or transverse science is so artfully negotiating, but that bifurcation itself is the institutionalization of the split between concept and intuition, and so all of the disciplinary job descriptions that you quite hilariously conjure up early on in the book, I don't know why you describe them exactly this way, but the suit and tie philosopher, the sleeves rolled up natural scientist, the artist, the different workplaces, the lab, the studio, the library, and so on and so forth. This narrowing, of knowledge into these different zones is itself a splitting in the concept itself, involving the convertibility of all knowledge into science and the narrowing of science into so-called scientific procedure and so on. But where does that? But that is also a degradation of art itself. And so I guess what I'm asking is, does this, this historical narrative, which is a grand narrative to be sure, and it doesn't really have necessary starting dates, but it seems to be pretty well, at least intensified, if not identified, with capitalism. So I'm just wondering, in that regard, what happens to that break, or if there's even such a thing between capitalist and pre-capitalist modes of experience. So, and for Benjamin, as for Adorno, it's not just about the losing or the effacement of mimetic capacity It's also the specter of this kind of compensatory return of mimesis in these, and this is where it gets a little bit politically dangerous, in these fantastic deformations where things are brought together by things that are brought together by similarity, has the effect of a caricature. So where features are exaggerated and so on. So the similarity of a dog to its owner, you know, becomes a caricature of that owner, and so on, and is therefore, you know, massively productive of likenesses and similarities by way of types, stereotypes, physiognomy, all the everything that was going on, the Galton, the visual averaging of the 19th century facial science and so on, that Benjamin himself saw in the caricatures, you know, of Colville, for example, you know, I really identified as a kind of sadism, where the whole universe, the whole cosmos, you know, arises through the, you know, through the world of plants, you know, and bears this kind of, and bears this cruelty on its sleeve. So seeing likenesses everywhere, call it allegorization, is also, you know, brings with it this this super politically charged and dangerous form. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that, if we have time for that. But the flip side of that, and this again has to do with the specific historical index of what I'll sort of venture to call modernity, also concerns the specific, you know, mimetic machinery of modernity itself. So the way in which photography and cinema for Benjamin are also described, you know, in mimetic terms, not as reproduction, but as realizations, enactments of the urge to bring near, an urge for proximity, and so on. The sort of the close-up being one privileged example of the optical unconscious, which brings us, you know, through the very mechanisms of industrial capitalism, brings us close to, you know, close to things, and thus reinvigorates mimesis. But these moments seem to be different in an interesting way, and so that was one of the things I wanted to ask you about. An affiliated question has to do with the archaic, which had I was wondering if you were thinking about this. Actually, I was kind of thinking about it as I kept encountering this language of swampiness and stagnation and weeds. It felt provocatively somehow. I mean, that this language would be used, and it really made me think of Benjamin's description of the swamp, the swampiness of Urgeschichte, and the sort of ambiguity and ambivalence of the or past, or the archaic. So I just wanted to, yeah, that was one of the, you know, large issues I just wanted to think about, vis-a-vis, you know, this kind of inertial drag, which you so evocatively described. And apropos of that inertial drag, I was also thinking, you know, language-wise, about this little word, this little overused word, like, which has been so degraded in recent times, and commodified into a thing, alike, and so on. But how, you know, in at least for how like itself, at least for a certain period and certain generation, you know, itself was a mark of hesitancy. Like it was for a long time, like was the verbal pause, where you would instead of saying you would say like. So it functioned as a kind of break and placeholder in language, until it became a kind of I don't know, why do we use like? Why do people use like? I don't really do that, but my kids do, as a indicator of quotation. So he was like, da, 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 so you say something, it's like, so as you're quoting, you're at the same time softening or the force of that reproduction. Okay, so that's one of my questions. The second, second question had to do with Marx, and the way in which you brought up Capital, Capital, the book, towards the end, well, almost at the very end, as things were kind of coming to a crescendo, I think, and why that was the place in Marx that you wanted to go. What would have been different in either Marx's analysis of capitalism, or in his analysis of history, his thoughts on history, if he had been more awake or more alert to the tug of the homeotic underpinnings underlying the system of value production, of exchange, of circulation, and so on. What would have changed if Marx had in fact recognized this tug of similarity? In your discussion of Darwin, it's very clear what was at stake, because genetics, kinship, breeding, natural selection, I mean, the whole apparatus that has given Darwinism a bad name, all that is at stake in Darwin's own ambiguous relationship to a likeness that he won in the same time by your very captivating account, celebrates and at the same time needs to tamp down or codify or restrict and harness to a kind of metaphysical external guarantor. So what would be different had likeness? What would be different in our thinking about capitalism and in our comportment towards it, if that homeotic thrust were to be acknowledged? I'm asking this for two reasons, and again, maybe this is just kind of a reflex Adorno, but here's the dumb question. Well, actually, they're both quite dumb questions. Isn't the occlusion of likeness, what you call its low homeotic index, part of the logic of reification itself, part of like an expression of commodification? So in that sense, a real abstraction in the zone of fatal sense. So isn't it just what reification is? The conversion of use value into exchange value. If we, do we even know what we mean by use value? So just to backtrack to your opening salvo, or opening steps here, the short step from likeness to infinity, and from infinity to the string of not quite equivalence, banality, indifference, indeterminacy, triviality, paradox, foolishness, nonsense, and so on. I think this is your wonderful list, and all the conundrums that you rehearsed in the opening sections. Does this short step not itself have a historical index? Call it capitalism, call it instrumental rationality, and so on. And my second question, which is a different one, but perhaps also vulgar, but it does pertain to what is at stake in retrieving this sphere, the stratum of likeness. So you're not endorsing or proposing some kind of critique, ideology critique, or demystification, or consciousness railing, or exposure. You're not exposing the hidden underbelly of likeness subtending the the production of values with the end of dissolving or exploding it, or of changing the world, at least by revolutionary means. And arguably Marx himself had become unsure of this by the time he was writing Capital. But I was puzzled, given what you're working towards the end of the book, and your very startling introduction of Emily Apter, this sort of the model of imitation that he's introducing here, and the way in which the imitation supersedes and can outweigh the original and all these things. I was wondering why, and this really isn't an approach. I was wondering why you didn't go to the 18th Brumaire. And I hate it when people do this. Why didn't you do this instead of that? Why don't you talk more about this? And that's not what I mean, because you've already done more than is humanly possible. But I'd really love to hear your thoughts, because on the one hand, you find in Marx, and I'm not sure that it's analogous or like we'll call for shorthand the ambivalence or ambiguity in Capital. But on the one hand, you find in Marx, this oft rebuked Platonism, this disavowal of imitation, of repetition, of parodic redoubling, of the culture industry of Louis Bonaparte, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, you seem to find, in this text itself, a coursing of mimesis and likeness, which is tethered to the very fate of revolution itself. So the 18th Brumaire, the reason I'm bringing this up is because this is not the discourse that is, because I am getting back to the question of breaks and historical ruptures again. The paradox of revolution in the 18th Brumaire, or that the 18th Brumaire really brings to the surface, is their contagious singularity. I mean, that there is a mimetic logic in the novum, which is revolution itself. And so revolution on the one hand has to provoke imitations. Revolution has to copy itself. It has to be copied. It has to be contagious. It has to spread, and its singularity itself has to, has to repeat itself. And this is part of, this is what revolutionary action, it seems to me, is so thoroughly. This paradox, this aporius with revolutionary action seems to be so thoroughly staging in the 18th Brumaire and elsewhere, that it has to appear as action, like action. It's a prototype, it's an exemplar of action. It has to recollect similar actions. It has to remember. It has to presage future actions. So if you like, likeness acquires its adverbial force in the act itself. So and this seems to me, this is why I would love to bring Benjamin and Marx back in here to think about history and the way in which likeness itself transforms the logic of rupture or revolution, but why likeness itself can and perhaps must, if that's not too dogmatic, let's just say probably can have a revolutionary valency or force. So I think I've probably said enough for now. We can come back to the psychoanalysis stuff if there's time. Okay.
That's so rich that if you start responding, you won't. Yeah. So if you can hold some of this in your mind.
I can hold it all.
Thank you so much. So Hent, please go.
Okay. I must begin with a confession. This is one of the most fascinating, wildly suggestive, yet also difficult books I've read in recent years, I would say. Beautifully written, in a distinct authorial voice, putting forward its critical terms and sustained arguments with great originality, clarity, and rigor, dense and also intense. Bizarre privileged items in the universe conveys what is simultaneously a strangely familiar, and I would like to say deeply metaphysical thought. It does so in the form of a thought experiment, taking the reader on an exciting journey with uncertain destinations. Indeed, the book offers nothing short of a meditation, albeit one, a metaphysical meditation at that, albeit one that dispenses with concepts such as substance and attributes, categories and causes, soul and God. Pierre Hadot claimed that the tradition of ancient, notably Stoic, spiritual exercises should be seen as a sort of physics rather than ethics. And it would seem, upon first glance at least, that Paul North's new book squarely falls into that rubric. But then its pages defy historical and contemporary genres and classifications as well. As a numbered series of more or less extended aphorisms, and sometimes even unelaborated propositions without further development, but put there plain and simple, the Tractatus Poetico-Philosophicus, as Georges Didi Huberman's endorsement has it. The book draws deliberately and confidently on ancient zoology, as confidently on ancient zoology as it does on the Darwinian theory of natural selection and evolution, on Proclus's Neoplatonism and mystical theology, as it borrows from Ludwig Wittgenstein's later and Henri Bergson's early works, on Willard van Orman Quine, Donald Davidson, and Hilary Putnam. Along the way and toward the end, we find remarkable analyses of Roger Caillois, whose words used as the epigraph of the book delivers the, at first, somewhat mysterious title, and Karl Marx, whose capital, as we already heard, Paul is retranslating. But also Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Gabriel Tarde, Isaac Newton and Gottlob Frege, Albrecht Dürer and Charles Sanders Peirce. And this list of further references and quasi-opposites could be quickly extended. Thinkers that did not seem to think alike become unlikely proponents of likeness, as their texts are read against the grain and in conversations they could not themselves have imagined. Where I come from, and I'm certainly not the only one to see things this way, or for the matter, the only one to now slowly starting to question this dogma. Where I come from, the dogma, the default interest guiding research and teaching, has not only been that of difference, the non-same or dissimilar, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, that of the fragmented, disconnected, and marginalized or sidelined, the other. One quickly realizes that one has encountered nothing short of an intellectual epochal event when a truly compelling proposal is made to radically reverse this dual, not to say dualistic, at times even Manichaean perspective, with its naive privileging of non-identity almost completely. Paul North's bizarre privileged items in the universe does just that, by laying out the critical terms, in fact, a new vocabulary and grammar, a logic of likeness instead. But it is so not by way of a theoretical coup, by simply assuming or postulating an alternative epistemology or ontology. Rather, its counterpoint takes the form of a spiritual and hence not merely intellectual exercise, which allows us to fathom in what way precisely likeness is the, and I quote, geist of the senses, the spirit of the senses. Moreover, we're dealing with a thought experiment, but one that is intended to produce an effect, that seeks not only to introduce and explore a different, in part age-old, in part innovative idiom, but also an alternative way of doing, including writing theory, so to speak. To do so requires, first of all, as he puts it, a transition from a naive to a reflective position, and one in which our eye and ear is skilled, trained to recognize and celebrate the principle or premise of homeosis, the term Paul borrows from Proclus, and interprets as meaning, and I quote, the interpenetration of like and unlike. Its axiom expresses the following overarching idea, whose imaginative, conceptual, and linguistic variations punctuate the book as a whole. I quote again. Everything is like everything in some respect. End of quote. And it is this view that North shows could eventually lead us to an appreciation not only of the happening rather than fixity or becoming of likeness, but also of the emergence rather than given existence or genesis of a complex cosmos, a new whole. Although I think saw it right. The aim of the spiritual exercise, as the beautiful book's cover flap calls it actually quite literally, spiritual exercise, especially one that takes its point of departure and continued reference in a physics rather than metaphysics, keeping transcendence at bay, and espousing a new form of naturalism, empiricism, and realism along the way. The procedure of that project is that of acquiring cosmic consciousness. A cosmic consciousness whose oceanic feeling and wild mysticism, these are terms that Adorno uses, is an invitation as much as a challenge to be met with determination, although the will, much less some version of voluntarism, will play little part in the book under consideration. Again, such a remarkably original, but in a sense also age-old perspective, has a no less startling implication, which is that in such a cosmos in which likeness forms the quote-unquote basic element, there can paradoxically and strictly speaking be neither beings nor being. Neither ontologically separate natural kinds, nor individual entities, nor states of affair, nor even the sum total of all entities, least of all some transcendent highest being beyond all aforementioned beings, can be distilled from the logic of likeness. Should we find that its principle or silent axiom must guide our thinking and doings. And the latter is hard enough to prove, since likeness not only occupies an indeterminable center, balancing somewhere between two extremes, to wit, the banality of sameness and the delirium of difference, but also Paul North's book echoes a long tradition of thought, to which Adorno devoted a whole book, namely The Veil of Isis. Also because likeness, like nature and being, quote unquote, likes to hide. Indeed, the very meaning of likeness is hard to pinpoint, not least since its overall premise, as Paul adopted here, does not purport that, quote, everything is like everything in the same respect, end of quote. Nor for the matter, that everything is alike in one single respect, as would be the case with substance ontology, as he puts it. Indeed, with reductionism of all stripes. Once more, such a perspective is remarkable, not least because it frontally confronts a modern dogma, which was also Michel Foucault's in The Order of Things. The assumption, namely, that modernity abandoned the ancient and medieval principle of likeness by substituting it by something else. Call it representational thinking, the mirror of nature, the mirroring of nature, inaugurating epistemology and other systems of classification. On North's view, nothing is less evident. And hence we might say that the modern world never happened, and that, quote unquote, the classical world never ended. Or again, and I quote again, that the archaic does not release its grip on the mind and nature, end of quote. For good and for ill, here, one must assume. This said, North's account has not only epistemological, but also semantic and semiotic implications, as is clear from his lapidary statement that, I quote, a name and a phenomenon are not best described as matching, but rather as alike in some respect, end of quote. After all, alike in some respect equals neither adequatio rei et intellectus, as in the classical definition of truth, nor the amalgamation or correspondence of word and object, nor a fortiori, I would say, the non-natural, that is differential, and in that sense arbitrary, that is negative rather than positive relation between the signifier and the signified, that generations of students of Ferdinand de Saussure learned to expose the humanities and the social sciences to. And yet, an interesting voice here seems to be missing. While Heidegger's Sein und Sein, being and time, is mentioned, an alternative model is not developed along the lines of the latter's later lectures on identity and difference, in which the distinction between das Gleiche, the formerly self-same, identical, and dasselbe, sameness more on the side of likeness, plays such a crucial role, and in which the co-belongingness, the Zusammengehörigkeit between words, concepts, and things, and eventually between world or earth and heavens, mortals and gods, seems to come close to what likening, or with a neologism, enlikening, which sounds a bit like an owning, means in the book under consideration. And yet a similar hint of intrinsic rather than imposed, or in Kantian parlance, synthetic connectedness is hard to deny in North's account of likeness and its logic. Moreover, as he reminds us with reference to theories of resemblance, identity, and difference, we find in John Locke, as well as in David Hume, that, quote, the premise of likeness, of everything, is a founding gesture of empiricism, end of quote. He said an organizing principle, as an organizing principle, the logic of likeness is more loose than the metaphysics of either substance or cause, whose logics propose, quote, alternative generalities for governing the manifold, end of quote. In sum, neither ontotheology nor modern mechanistic natural philosophy can explain or explain away likeness and its far more paradoxical logic. For one thing, as North helpfully puts it, and I quote, likeness doesn't stick everything together with the same strength as cause or substance, probably because it doesn't structure the world into unambiguously independent individuals with modular parts, end of quote. For another, likeness in whatever non-quantifiable measure or under whatever aspect seen from the distance or rather up close requires a certain, however minimal, continuum in and between matter and mind to be somehow, if not somewhere or sometime, in place. Operating outside of, or alternatively deeply inside spatio-temporal coordinates, or even space-time continuums, likeness occurs and occasions happens when and where it will. That may be an assumption few moderns are willing to buy into, stubbornly refusing to import forgotten or long dismissed holozoistic or spiritualist assumptions into our conceptual schemas, explaining the world to ourselves. But certainly, this is at least formally or structurally, if not, so to speak, materially, the direction we are reoriented towards in North's proposal. Sure, one can say, and I quote, what something is the respects and ways in which it is like other things, end of quote. But needless to say, the dialectician would object that the reverse holds true just as well. What then helps us weigh the distinction between likeness and unlikeness and the privilege of the former over the latter? As North puts it, and I quote, taking precedence is a matter of orientation and emphasis, not a matter of quantity. It's not that there is more likeness in the world than unlikeness. And therein lies the universe's, he continues, and therein lies the universe's precarious balance. Alike by a hair for a time, by orientation and emphasis, balanced over an abyss of unlikenesses that could at any time swallow up the correspondence, end of quote. One could easily see how this is an attractive view. According to it, for example, and I quote, culture names the constitutive nearness of practices, no matter how eccentric, and culture thereby nears nature as what becomes acculturated, made into tools, end of quote. But how and why is this preferable over the insistence on the constitutive distance of practices, no matter how familiar? I will return to this concern at the end of my remarks. Be this as it may, does likeness indeed have or obey a logic? Would one want it to have a logic at all? And more importantly, since we can allow the latter term to have some bandwidth, some likeness with other forms of, say, pure or fuzzy logic, does its mechanism or operation let itself be inscribed in what is a decidedly empiricist and immanentist, if not necessarily naturalist and materialist idiom, and now new field of study? What makes items, notably bizarre privileged items, fit in the cosmic, but also strangely acosmic and beyond cosmic universe that we're being invited to enter and explore in this book? In and for themselves, likeness and likenesses inexist, we might say. It is their mode of, I'm tempted to say, pragmatic situatedness, their privileging by us and by others, that makes them manifest, apparent, and indeed happen. In the context of the discussion of Darwin, North introduces the following proposition. I quote, a single resemblance draws you effortlessly to a milieu of resemblances, from an individual to a family, say, which leads on to a breed, which leads on to a species, which leads on to a X, making, formally speaking, anything a milieu that leads on to a milieu of milieus, end of quote. Yet one wonders, are such affinities or overlaps themselves real? Do they have, as the medievals would say, a fundamentum in re? Do they have a basis in reality? Or is it our wonder at likenesses, inaugurating an extended metaphorology of sorts that is here at work? And overlap, if not indeed also likeness itself, is a metaphor after all. And if likeness is not to be subsumed under the biological notion of life, or under the metaphysics of birth, if it moreover is not a quantifiable variable grade or value, then what is it, if not merely a label that we attribute or ascribe to phenomena at will, or rather, whenever we are so impressed? We know what it is not, even for Darwin, as North recalls, and I quote, when you go so far as to say that the naturalness of a field of natural organisms consists in its inner affinities, you are also saying that affinities operate by a different logic than the arrangement of parts in a whole, or the synergy of organs within an organism. Nature, a loose, baggy concept, too big to contain anything at the best of times, is stitched together, as it were, through the affinities among creatures. And though the thread of those stitches may be genetic, the pattern of the stitches is resemblance, not causal functional arrangement. The thought of a general milieu of resemblance internal to the organic field, but of a different order than it, was what Darwin was with Darwin from early on. End of quote. As said, likeness then is the spirit of the senses, that is, of the sensible animate, and one must assume also inanimate world, and internal to it, but not to be identified with its basic elements and natural laws, incommensurable with it. It is its ether, its atmosphere, and its ambiance, so to speak. Likeness then, not equivalent to similarity or resemblance, has no fixed place in ontology or, for that matter, in aesthetics. In the framework of ontology, North writes, likeness would probably fall in the category of relation, itself a category beset by its own difficulties, end of quote. And as one of the later sections of the book notes, likeness is therefore immediate, just as it overlaps with being, even though it is most certainly not quite it, not quite being, that is. Quote, being mysterious then forms part of likeness's personality, just as not being singular forms part of its complexity. You can read that as a rejection of transcendence. Nothing transcends likeness that could distinguish within it once and for all the exact proportion of likeness and unlikeness. And nevertheless, both, that is, likeness and unlikeness, are always at work, end of quote. But likeness is not only mysterious, it is also magic. As North notes in the section devoted to Marx's fixation on process and products, including their circulation. I quote, no part of the capital system can function without the homeotic magic that multiplies products and their qualities. Marx's reticence to take an interest in likeness, in enlikening, one could guess, stems from the fact that enlikening is neither a material process that he can uncover, nor an ideal process that he can undermine, end of quote. By the way, why this means that the likeness is therefore, quote unquote, the aesthetic substance of society, and as such cannot be critiqued, I do not fully grasp, as this seems to me, well, a bizarre privileging of the aesthetic as a category, or indeed item, among many equi-primordial candidates for that role. But I will leave that for now. Nothing like likeness, therefore. Everything, even unlikeness, hinges on it. And just as Spinoza's nature or God does not equal atomistic or mechanistic matter, there is a way in which the logic of likeness outruns the measured reach of the physical universe, of the natural and social world altogether. Quote, there are more modes of resemblance than family resemblances. For certainly you are exactly as much like your mother as like a stone. You only need the atmosphere. You need only change the atmosphere. In reference to physicality against the background of immaterial things, gods or future states of affairs, you are like a stone as is your mother, end of quote. One wonders whether Wittgenstein would agree. Brilliant in the book are the pages in which we find a surprising reading of Wittgenstein and Bergson, bien étonné de se trouver ensemble, as raising and answering each other's questions. North can be seen here as unlocking the potential of Wittgenstein's idea of aspect seeing and aspect shifting. The details of this analysis, as the earlier one of Plato's Parmenides as read by Proclus, are extremely subtle and subversive, but hard to summarize without trivializing their tour de force. Suffice it to say then that these readings prepare a view of likeness and unliking that dispenses with the modern logic of causation and process, of asymptotic approximation and perfectibility. Quote, when homeostasis happens, something refuses to move, something says no to distance, space and times and motion as well, end of quote. If any direct or immediate ethical political stance there is in this account of likeness and the bizarre privileging of items in the universe it makes us aware of, it is perhaps this stillness, hesitation, and pause, which of course is a form of militant refusal as well. This brings me in conclusion to my single most important concern and question regarding the overall purchase of the book's central claims and arguments. Well, the agenda of bizarre privileged items in the universe is, of course, not to pay lip service to some Obama-esque mantra going like there is more than we share in common and sets us apart. One wonders what political axioms and maxims would follow from the book's subtle counter-perspective. Is replacing the emphasis and privileging of on and privileging of likeness over unlikeness, difference the other, amenable to a radical, even revolutionary insistence on egalitarianism in forms or practices of freedom that let themselves be universalized, and where the will or reflective consciousness and militant affect to do so emerges? Or does the call to be more attentive and attuned to likeness stand in the perennial risk of unwittingly fostering regimes of the same and self-same? Why stressing likeness rather than its correlative unlikeness now? What difference does, and if more fully understood, can it now make? I am aware that the pages in the last part of the book devoted to Marx and to the agential aspect of likeness and enlightening offer elements of an answer, or perhaps may render this question much more than objection eventually moot. But it should perhaps be raised nonetheless. One way of answering it in my own language would be to say that in order to overthrow a world that deserves nothing less, we need to first fully inherit it and more clearly say how we are very much alike all we dislike or think of as unlike. To the extent that metaphysics and, say, capitalism structure our very language, we have no alternative, perhaps, but to realize that complicity and accept that the shortest path is the longest. In other words, that there is no easy way out or beyond. I often wonder whether this was not fundamental to Jacques Derrida's view, dating back all the way to off-gravitology, when he explained that we should not just think of words and things, including their order, other than seeing them as being subjected to a logic of non-synonymous substitution. Also known from his later work, notably Limited Ink, where he speaks of this feature as one of iterability. Or again, later in conversation with the later Emmanuel Levinas, when he characterizes this as a seriature. And series, I should note, are discussed extensively throughout the book. As you will recall, the logic of non-synonymous substitution boils down to the n+1 formula, which is of course also that in French of the plus d'un, that is of the more than one and no more than one. Repetition, including change. Such a logic would or could be multi-dimensional and is anything but unidirectional or even oppositional, dialectical, and still account for likenesses and unlikenesses to happen, for good and for ill. That is, depending on how we individually and collectively ride the waves the substitutes, like and unlike, keep making. On this view, the ethical political question is not capricious. And indeed, as North concludes his book, not without humor, quote, sociality itself as a whole comes to look like a bizarre privileged item in the universe, a BPIU in its own right, and as such a good object for a homeotic science, end of quote. And with a concluding proposition without further comment, I quote, anything can be a BPIU. The homeotic science then, quote, finds and makes items that collect and reflect likenesses in particularly intensive ways, end of quote. And one might add, it expands and supplements them. And here again, the criterion of ethical and political consequence. What likenesses, if not say interests, coalesce such that their power is most immediately and acutely, dare I say responsibly and simultaneously most effectively felt is pertinent. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
So much.
Our time is getting late, but I will first thank our respondents. I do want to leave Paul some time to mull these responses over. Let me just say a few things. This book sort of drops in a range of contexts that I think are studiously unaddressed by Paul. You know, it's a decision not to. And I thought it would be interesting, in the sense of reading it a little bit against the grain, to describe its own, give you a sense of the oddity given where our critical landscape is. And I'll just make a few points about that. So the form of the book, as has already been mentioned, is these numbered entries. They're full of dense concentrates of statements, demonstrations, speculations. The structure is paratactic. In other words, it's sort of like Caesar's I came, I saw, I conquered. And block notes or kernels. But they also facilitate certain kinds of associative leaps because there aren't transitions. As when we shift from a comment on the way enlightening works in Marx's Capital to the becoming teacher of the student or the specter haunting education, which turns out to be not enlightening, but imitation. So this free form, it's both free form exposition, but also very tight. It's one and the same. It's associative, and it's little pieces that are very much explosive and in turn on themselves. So this tends to divorce this book from most familiar contexts of reception. So what are those contexts potentially? We've already much cited everything is like everything in some respect. It sounds almost promiscuous, right? But it relates to questions around relationality, object relations, relational aesthetics, triple O and the problem of reductionism or irreductionism, the democracy of persons and things. If everything relates to everything, there's a kind of potentially a sort of leveling of hierarchies, right? They can all relate. And yet there's a strong resistance to the way in which object-oriented ontology or actor network theory has tried to create that leveling, right? So there's a polemic, I would say, that's sort of sub rosa, that's taking issue with it without ever actually engaging Latour or Tristan Garcia or Graham Harman or any of the people who, any of those usual suspects. And beyond that, then, so the second thing is the context of debates around identity and difference. And of course, I think of some of the the more philosophical ways that's been treated by Etienne Balibar on this wonderful consideration of the word conscience between languages and consciousness. And with that differentiation, différence, there are so many, and the kind of elephant in the room, which is identity politics and the notion of what is the status of identity, or is it like-mindedness? Is it identification in a political sense of going towards solidarities, of claims to a kind of identitarian political position? So that's not really taken on. But there is something, I would say, that gestures towards the non-exclusionary logic. The non-exclusionary logic, which is quite profound and which indirectly gets at some of these stalemates or impasses between identity and difference, as if they were sort of opposed to each other. I'll just mention briefly the media landscape in which we're constantly being solicited to like. Rebecca and certainly explored that. Something that expresses preference, or that's just phatic speech, right? Just like, or that refers to like-mindedness, common identity of shared objects. Another context in which this drops is what we now call in AI, predictive processing, pattern recognition, likenesses as an instrument of racial bias, right? Facial recognition software. Lots to be said about that. That's, it's as if the present day, some of the furors around the politics of pattern recognition, carefully not in the book. Then there's a wonderful art historical debate, which is an old one around what's called pseudomorphosis. And here I would refer you to a wonderful piece by Yves Lambois called The Uses and Abuses of Lookalikes. And, so basically this is the emergence of form A from is morphologically analogous to or even identical with form B, yet entirely unrelated to it from a genetic point of view. Yves Lambois says that the phenomenon of lookalikes across geographically and historically distant cultures fascinated archaeologists, art historians, anthropologists, and linguists in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And their competing explanations, the permanence of human nature, human migrations in a distant past, were far from persuasive, he says, and actually embarrassing. And I don't know if any of you can remember back to the big debate around the primitivism show at the Museum of Modern Art, where they took Picasso's and they took primitive art, and the big term was affinities. Well, these are the kinds of embarrassing or annoying things that Yves is criticizing. He says, nothing irritates me more than being presented a tantric image as a Malevich simile. The implication that since the works are morphologically similar, their meaning must be identical as well. Ergo, Malevich was purely and simply a mystic. And it goes on like this. And one of his lessons is that the tribal modern trap, or the archaic and the modern trap of affinities, says if two objects look the same, it doesn't mean that they have much in common, much less than they have the same meaning. But if they have something in common, this might reside in their strategy, or at least in their conditions of possibility. And I think that's something that actually your book intervenes in very interestingly. We've already spoken a lot about the homeosis, homeotics, and this verb in likening, Wittgenstein as a homeotician, and the wonderful analysis he offers of the duck rabbit. Now, the duck rabbit is interesting because it creates a kind of, there's a tension in this debate that you really delve into. First of all, a duck rabbit is a visual amphibole. It's two things at once. But Paul interprets it as the grand challenge to the univocity of sight. And he cites Plotinus on this. Rabbit is not only distinguished by not being duck, it's constituted out of something like a rabbit atmosphere. And if you read Quine on this, it's a lot of fun too. But then Paul comes up with this wonderful sentence. He says, a likeness circuit lights up in resonance with the surround. And this resonance helps determine what seeing sees. What's interesting to him here isn't to come out on one side or the other so much as to approach this question of how seeing sees through an almost mystical vocabulary, the Platonian vocabulary, the Platonian transparency, call it, that becomes very much a kind of cosmic thing. And I love this. He says, he criticizes Wittgenstein's Duck Rabbit for favoring a congruence that forfeits the rewards of Platonian transparency. He sees it as Wittgenstein's philosophy removes entities from atmospheres, thus emitting an airless atmosphere for its investigation. So what he's criticizing is the either or, the separation of the twinning image, and the insistence on a kind of univocity, visual univocity. What he wants us to accommodate our eyes to seeing are the bizarre overlaps in nature. The bizarre overlaps in nature. And of course, I love this idea, but I also thought, well, what would you think about the psychoanalytic condition of apophenia? You know, seeing faces in clouds, getting subliminal messages from the telegraph poles, you're being told by Q to obey certain things. I mean, what I'm getting at is something Rebecca already raised, which is that what's, again, sort of studiously avoided here is how some of your conclusions, how some of your Platonian readings could go into the direction of psychoanalysis, of paranoid reading, and you are not a symptomatic reader, and yet, by telling us we should accommodate our eyes to bizarre overlaps in nature, you are encouraging us to become more hypersymptomatic or open to it, even if it's in the service of something that is to do with a path of enlightening, if not enlightening, or open to resonances and emanations. So I would say, looking at Hent a little bit, that you choose the mystical vocabulary over the psychoanalytic, but you could go both ways. Okay, and so finally, I too, we've already talked about some of the major anchor thinkers here: Benjamin, Plotinus, Caillois, and then Marx. And Marx comes in the end, and it's really, really interesting. And we've already spoken a little bit about it. As was mentioned in Sacher's introduction, you're working on a new translation of Capital. And so one obvious question is, how does that relate or not to this book? And Hent and Rebecca have also already given us some ideas. The one that I would stress is this question that Peter Zendi actually raised in his reading of the manuscript that you cite in the footnote, of a homeotic economy that counters a certain, that's on Marx's wavelength in a way. And I'll just say a few things about that. This is a quote from Paul summarizing Zendi. Homeosis may itself operate as an economy, though it is a strange one without equivalence, symmetry, or transitivity, and perhaps also without luxury, a pure reciprocity. Okay, now how could homeosis, which you've criticized as having too much, in a sense, enlightening through qualia, and it's kind of a problematic, and then how can we sort of, what kind of strange economy are you after, is my question very simply. And as you note, and I love this, this is my favorite passage in the book, Marx cries, says Paul, how twisted capitalism is when it makes what it is by nature different equivalent. What is by nature different equivalent. This is capitalism's basic perversion. He relies on a cliche that what is different is essentially different. The transformation of difference into equivalence Marx calls a reduction an operation on a thing in which all of its sensuous characteristics are extinguished. Paraphrasing Marx here. And then he adds, all now, equalization murders difference. That is the ontological wage of capital. And I'm like, okay, so here's my general questions with which I'll conclude. This is an astonishing phrase, equalization murders difference. You seem to set it up to make a case for indifference, an indifference that reacts against the perversion of the commodity, its violent imposition of equivalence on unlike things. And you seem to want to return us to a regime of relation based on a principle of likening that is true to need, you use this term, or sufficient to basic necessity. And here I think we could go into a lot more, but I want to stop you en route to that argument about this sort of alternative, this other strange economy that returns us to need. I want to stop you en route to that argument and ask you to say more about how you distinguish in Marx and also for yourself this term equalization from equivalence or the general equivalent. Are they both equally murderous? Is that what you mean by that? And then where does equality fit in? Or something that's kind of fascinating me right now, even though I am not very competent to deal with it, equals, as in the function of the symbolic equal sign in mathematics and logic, which is a hugely complicated issue. But it does come back, it really, since you're interested in logic, I think it's actually important here. How does equality or equals, as in equals to, or, and Raymond Boyce and others are interested in this problem politically, how do you make equal? What is making equal or extra egalitarianism? And that pushes you more into the more political theory angle as opposed to this one about economy and the alternative to equivalence or equalization. So I will stop there, but I think we've given you a whole bunch. I'm glad this is recorded actually because I need to go back. Yeah, so do what you will with all that.
Really quickly, I don't want to try everyone's patience. So I won't do much because it's late and it was a lot. And I have to say, just for all of you who are working on dissertations, I had a terrible dissertation defense. And every time something like this happens, which has been about 3 times since then, I feel like I'm being redeemed. It's the greatest possible dissertation defense that anyone could have, to have these people reading this book and saying really the key things. So just thank you, first of all, for taking it so seriously. As you can tell, if there was this movie in the 70s, it's a mad world. This is just Change World for Book. And you've got this. It tries to do something different and really invent itself along the way. And it does challenge some of our go-to formulas about changing the world, about what Marx is good for, about what history is or whether there's history. I'll say just briefly to Rebecca, when it's right, the main question, which I can't answer till the second volume, which I'll never write. But Benjamin was really torn, I think, between something like a historical unconscious, which he never names as such, which would be an archaic, swampy world. He identifies it in Kafka, having read Beethoven and thinking of Mutterrecht, which is a pre-mythological stage, a stage that can't lead to bad politics, he thinks, in which there's something like ambiguity and the opportunity for new regimes, reorganizing the cognitive faculties, or politicizing, in his sense, a kind of mode that could come back, that never went away, that would allow for a liquefying of relations, as he called it. So I'm not sure I would give up on historicity, or even the historicity of likeness, but I'm interested in Benjamin's thought that something persists, which in some way is a more disturbing thought. The disturbing thought at the center of psychoanalysis. Something persists, you can't get at it, it gets at you. It's not the same, but it's continuing to affect you. And that may be what, in Benjaminian terms, the regime, the zone of likeness is. So I'm not sure if it challenges the other modes of understanding, like causal, quasi-causal, right? History as a continuum with the ruptures is also, the rupture is a rupture in linked chains that just end. I'm not sure it challenges that completely, but it does give a different view and different possibilities. And I think the challenge to those other schemata and the challenge to ontology would be its politics. And that would be, I understand the concern. I've had people attack me for suggesting that racialization is a good thing. Not exactly the way to put it. But let's say facial recognition is something that depends on likeness. It's a kind of horrific instrument of government control, right? Control, violence, and likeness seems to be one of the basic elements of it. So I wouldn't argue that likeness is either naturally resistant to governmentality or violence or brutality. It can't be co-opted. But I do think that's much more about identifying a particular entity. So likeness is in service of identity, as you mentioned there, of naming and typing a whole. And the only good thing about likeness as its own mode is that something gets to be an entity only insofar as, under certain conditions, the likenesses between it and something else emerge. And those conditions are not fixed in any way. In fact, there are multiple conditions for different likenesses going on at all moments, in all places. The other worry that everyone expressed to some degree, definitely Hent and Rebecca, I think, is the kind of unruly amorphousness of this and the difficulty bringing it into a critical project, I would say. And I think I agree. Hent, you asked, are overlaps real? And are they just psychological, you asked? Or does it take a human interpreter to bring up the happening of likenesses between things? And I'm trying to argue that there is always an atmosphere or a milieu. It could be the mind. But as Darwin shows, it's also a species. So it's not just the evolutionary scientist that recognizes the likenesses among entities, or the likenesses among species in order to talk about an evolutionary development, a branch on the tree. It's not just if evolutionary theory is true, you don't even need an evolutionary theorist to do that. Nature is organized such that, well, there's questions about the methodology here and how you could tell it from nature, but let's just imagine that it's right. How you could tell, that a species is aimed towards likeness. Reproduction aims towards likeness. It doesn't even aim towards, let's say, an environmentally fit or adapted. It aims towards likeness, to keep things more or less the same in a particular niche that has been constructed. So that's how I'm trying to think of it, that nature has likeness as a goal, the production of likeness. It does need some third instituting frame. And that's also, I think, where the politics might be. As Peirce brought in an interpretant to semiotics, where the sign and the signifier are really joined, and they're meaningfully joined for a certain project or a purpose from a particular perspective, I think the same thing happens with likeness. So in my heart of hearts, I'm saying something like what literary scholars can do, which is what artists can do, is they can make these frames. That the job of a philosophical literary criticism would be to make the frames in which things that weren't seen to be like can happen as family. That sounds much too rosy for my usual cynical outlook on things, but there it is. I don't think I should say much more because it's so late. So maybe I'll just thank you and thank you all for sticking with it, and I appreciate it. Do we want to have responses? I feel like it's.
How are you doing, audience? I mean, normally we'd be timing with a glass of wine until we eat and have another win, but we could go till 8, a little after 8.
I think what I'm going to do is fly to Toronto and finish this conversation with Rebecca as soon as this is over. There's so much to say.
Are there any audience questions?
Let's do that.
Or maybe,
Yeah.
Rebecca, did you have any?
All right. I think, shouldn't we let the audience have a chance to speak?
Yes, sure.
Before you collapse,
Before you-
raise your hand.
Only if you can. Just want to make sure that. Ivan.
Without reading the book, I wanted to ask you about the Brain Mantis that I think was mentioned at some point in the beginning.
Yeah.
Because what happens, what I was thinking is that the Brain Mantis, when it simulates the leaf, it disappears.
Yeah.
We can no longer see it, and that's the whole point of it trying to simulate the leaf, or that logic of simulation behind it. And so I was wondering, how can one recognize their likenesses when it disappears? And if you have thought at all about the logic of disappearance, perhaps in relation to the more mystical notions that seem to be around in the whole book, because of like the dissolution of the self in divine love, for instance,
Yes.
which is the same thing. And I was thinking about Neoplatonic notions of the cosmic relation between things being founded on love in Ficino or in Leon Hebreo, and whether you have thought about the relation between likeness and love.
That's great. Actually, that's what I was going to talk about today. It was kind of beautiful and kind of horrific. Early discussion of love, which is the basis of the dialectic, and the difference between loving and liking. I think my partner would like me to prefer liking, but I kind of do. Well, I think this book is for you. But I don't know if I agree with the term mystical, but I see, compared to psychoanalysis, it definitely seems mystical. Caillois has this beautiful image of the one who is looking for likenesses is a kind of a paranoiac who externalizes themselves into the world such that they become invisible in it. They become the brain mantis and disappear into the world by finding all of these overlaps, not being able to distinguish anymore. Also, their psyche from the world, which is maybe one definition of the paranoiac.
Innocence.
Dehiscence, exactly. There's a coming loose of things, which I like. Again, the politics I still have to work out, and my turn to Marx came after this, really. So,
Socrates.
yes.
So this follows on somewhat from the Brain Mantis, and it has to do with Caillois and the other side of Caillois, which would somehow be the collège side, which has to do with a certain sacralization of social life, but with the aim of the restoration of hierarchical difference. And so it seemed to me that side of Caillois, for better or worse, was missing here. And that side has a view of the world as being made up of producers and consumers, which he has an account of that is very surprising insofar as it places masters on the side of producers and slaves on the side of consumers. And then it develops into this very strange sexual fantasy fantasy as well. And in this account, sort of mimetic insects are just beings that no longer have the energy that establish difference. So in a sense, all these fantasy about the hierarchy of difference and domination. So it would also have to do with a certain kind of worry about equivalence and so I was wondering whether you left that out, sort of in a sense to avoid going into the psychoanalytic, or why that sign of Caillois is not here, and perhaps this is a slightly different question, but it goes back to the thing you said about frames. And what does this mean for comparison? What does your book do for comparison?
Yeah, well, those are two very different questions, although trying to make more distinctions in this mess, I guess, would define both hierarchies and comparison. So I think that's the reaction. It's like, well, this is just going to be a mess. And the questions are, well, what happens to hierarchy? What happens to difference? What happens to the individual or the subject? And those are good questions. In terms of Caillois' Catholicism, in terms of his peculiar ideas of human sociality, problematic ideas, I think what's interesting, like as with Freud, is that he was totally open about the fact that he's basically terrified of the opposite of that, which is sinking into indistinction. And those hierarchical thoughts don't come up as much in his, for example, in the writing of Stones. He's not interested in that at all. So I think he's a little bit schizoid about that. I think he's looking out at nature and saying, well, maybe human hierarchical sociality has no basis. Certainly the writing of Stones, Stones are the primary mirrors in which nature reflects itself. That's not the greatest answer, but it is an answer. In comparison, I don't know. I don't know how these other operations that we do are built on likeness. It certainly involves likeness. So you don't compare things. This is the joke of comparative literature. You don't compare things that are not comparable, that have some ground, right? You make the ground, you invent the ground, or you might even go really far. But the dissertation job is always to say, well, here's the milieu in which these two things make sense with one another.
But can I just, so this is, again, something that there's a science for that. It's called rhetoric. And rhetoric has spent its history, its life, coming up with terms of comparison that are around likeness, whether it's, simile, equivalence, commensurability, and all the tropes, metalepsis, everything really is about a determination or measurement of likeness.
Between
figuration is, we have to then bring back all of Paul Demon here.
Okay, as long as we don't have to bring back Paul Demon.
No,
But don't you think, Emily?
That's available to you, and you wonderfully chose not to avail yourself. In fact, the discussion of language and its metacritical apparatus we're talking about is, it appears here and there, but not in a conventional way.
But there is, there's a section on language in Benjamin and Peirce, which tries to look at it the other way. But don't you think, rhetorical criticism was an explosion? And that's where I learned everything. But there is a metaphysics of rhetoric that is there. Comparison implies metaphysically distinct things. So is metaphor, really, that an operation has been carried out on. So you have a kind of landscape that's very traditional for the most part. Figura is different, and there are some rhetorical figures that are really different. But the most used ones And that's why Derrida could worry about metaphor in the body of philosophy, because it was at once holding up the normal ontology, something's carrying over, but it couldn't explain itself except by a kind of mad self-referentiality, right? So the figure doesn't carry it out fully, but it makes reference to the same ontology over and over. That's what I would say. So my search is for other figures to see if this can be fleshed out.
Okay, maybe on that one.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Well,